The day had come for Jason to move into his new apartment, a small, cozy place located in the heart of the city. He was excited about the prospect of living alone for the first time. But what made the situation even more unique was his new roommate, Zira. Zira wasn't human. She was an alien from a distant planet, sent to Earth as part of an intergalactic exchange program. The idea seemed far-fetched at first, but Jason had signed up for this experience on a whim, intrigued by the idea of living with someone completely different from him. Little did he know, this decision would take him on a journey he never could have predicted. Jason's first impression of Zira was nothing out of the ordinary. She looked similar to a human in many ways, with soft green skin that shimmered faintly under the apartment's overhead lights. Her eyes, however, were the most striking feature, large, glowing with an amber hue that seemed to pierce through the air with a sense of intelligence and mystery. She didn't speak much when they first met, greeting him with a gentle nod and a warm smile. Jason had expected a more awkward encounter, but Zira's calm presence made everything seem easy. She was unlike any person he had ever met. They spent the first few days exchanging pleasantries, getting to know each other little by little. But Jason soon realized there was something strange about her that he couldn't quite place. The apartment was small enough that they both had their own space, yet it felt oddly cramped as the days went on. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that Zira was always watching him. Though she rarely said much, she was quiet, composed, and always seemed to be lost in her own thoughts. But Jason had no reason to be concerned. She was kind, after all, and treated him with a respect that felt comforting. Still, there was something unsettling about the way she would stare at him from time to time, especially when he wasn't looking. It wasn't until a few days into the week that Jason started to notice the first signs that something was off. At first, it was small, strange whispers at night that he couldn't make sense of. He'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of Zira moving around in the dark, her footsteps oddly light for someone of her size. But when he'd ask her about it the next morning, she would always brush it off, claiming she was just meditating or doing some sort of ritual. Jason didn't know much about alien rituals, but he didn't press her. She was different, and that was part of the appeal. Then there were the eyes. He began noticing that Zira's amber-colored gaze would linger on him longer than usual, especially when they were alone. It wasn't the kind of look that made him uncomfortable in a dangerous way. Rather, it felt as though she were studying him, trying to understand him in a way that went beyond words. It was as though she could see deeper into his soul, or perhaps it was just his imagination running wild. He'd never met an alien before, and there was a part of him that wondered if this was just how they communicated. The strangest part of all, however, came when Jason overheard a conversation between Zira and someone else, though he couldn't quite understand the words. One evening, as he passed her room, he heard her speaking in a language that sounded entirely alien to him. It was soft and melodic, but there was an edge to it, like a vibration that rattled his bones. Jason had no idea what she was saying, but it sounded like an argument of some kind, and it wasn't directed at him. When he knocked on her door to check in, Zira quickly quieted and greeted him with a soft smile, as if nothing had happened. She explained it away, as always, saying she was simply communicating with her home planet. Jason didn't know if he believed her, but he didn't press the issue. Maybe this was just the nature of living with someone so different. As the days passed, Jason grew more accustomed to Zira's quirks, and they began to fall into a routine. She would spend her days in her room, working on mysterious projects that Jason never quite understood. She seemed more distant, though Jason assumed it was just the way aliens were. They didn't need constant social interaction the way humans did. He focused on his work, went to the gym, and tried to make sense of his new life. He often wondered what Zira did when he wasn't around. She rarely left the apartment, and when she did, it was always for brief periods of time. Jason assumed she was just running errands or exploring the city, but something told him that there was much more to her life than she let on. One evening, as Jason sat on the couch watching a movie, He caught Zira staring at him again. This time, however, it wasn't just a brief glance. She looked at him intently, her amber eyes glowing even brighter than usual. And for a moment, Jason felt a strange chill run down his spine. It wasn't fear. No, it was something else. Something deeper. It was as if, in that moment, Zira was about to reveal something to him. Something that would change everything. "Jason," Zira said, her voice soft but steady, "there's something you should know about me." She stepped closer to him, her presence filling the room in a way that felt almost too intense. "I don't want you to be afraid, but I need to tell you that things are about to change." Jason's heart raced. The unease he had been feeling for the past few days suddenly intensified. Something was different. He didn't know what to expect, but whatever it was, he could sense it was coming soon. And from the way Zira was looking at him, he knew that whatever happened next would be more than he was ready for. As Zira's words hung in the air, Jason couldn't help but wonder, what was it about this alien roommate that had him so on edge? And what was it about her season that was about to shake everything he thought he knew about his life and his place in the universe? Jason awoke to the sound of a strange humming noise filling the apartment, a low, almost vibrating tone that seemed to come from all directions. It was a sound unlike anything he had ever heard before. At first, he tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the oddities of living with an alien. But the humming didn't stop, and it was growing louder, as if it were coming from Zira's room. Jason glanced over at the clock, nearly 3 in the morning. Curiosity tugged at him, and after a few moments of hesitation, he quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound. He moved toward her door, the humming now unmistakably coming from inside her room. The door creaked softly as Jason pushed it open, his heart thumping in his chest. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Zira was standing in the center of the room, her eyes closed, her hands raised as if she were conducting some sort of invisible force. The air around her seemed to shimmer, rippling like water disturbed by an unseen current. The humming sound was now a pulsing rhythm, echoing through the room as though it were alive, resonating with something deep within her. Jason froze, not sure whether he should enter or retreat. Zira's movements were fluid, almost hypnotic, as she swayed slightly with the rhythm of the sound. He was about to step back when her amber eyes snapped open, locking onto his with an intensity that made his skin prickle. For a brief moment, there was silence, and then, without a word, Zira turned her gaze back toward the center of the room, as though Jason wasn't even there. The humming continued, and Jason stood at the doorway, feeling as though he were intruding on something he wasn't meant to witness. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Was this some kind of alien ritual, or was this part of what she had mentioned, the mysterious season she had referred to? Zira's voice broke the silence, soft but firm. "You shouldn't be here, Jason." He took a hesitant step into the room, his voice a whisper, almost as if afraid to disturb the air around them. "What is this? What's happening?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slowly lowered her arms, and the ripples in the air gradually faded, the humming sound growing quieter with each passing second. Zira's eyes, though still glowing faintly, softened as she looked at him. "It's my mating season," she said, her voice calm but tinged with something Jason couldn't quite identify. Maybe regret, maybe an emotion he couldn't place. Jason stood there, stunned. "Mating season," he echoed, trying to comprehend the weight of her words. This was the thing she had been alluding to, but hearing it out loud brought it to a whole new level of reality. He had no idea how to respond. The thought of his alien roommate, who had seemed so composed, so distant, now caught in some kind of natural, uncontrollable cycle, left him feeling more confused than ever. Zira nodded slowly. "It's not something I can easily explain, Jason. It's part of who I am. My species goes through this phase every year, and it affects us deeply, physically, emotionally. I can't control it completely." Jason felt a pang of unease at her words. What do you mean can't control it? Are you dangerous right now? Zira's expression faltered for just a moment, and Jason caught a glimpse of something raw in her eyes, a vulnerability that she had never shown before. No, she replied, her voice steady but with a hint of sadness. I won't hurt you, Jason, but it's hard to explain. The emotions, they overwhelm me. It's not just a physical change, it's the instincts that come with it. The need to bond, to connect. My kind, she hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. We don't always understand our own reactions. Jason didn't know how to respond. His mind was racing. He had assumed that living with an alien would be a unique experience, but this was something entirely different. He had no idea what he was walking into, and now that he was, it felt as though he were standing on the edge of a cliff, uncertain of what was waiting for him at the bottom. He watched Zira as she stood there, the tension in her posture palpable. The alien before him, who had seemed so calm and composed only days ago, was now visibly shaken, struggling to manage the turmoil inside. Jason took a step forward, trying to offer some reassurance, though he wasn't sure how to approach the situation. Zira, he said softly, his voice quiet but steady, you don't have to go through this alone. I don't really understand it, but I'm here. I'll help however I can. Zira's eyes flickered, a hint of surprise crossing her face. You would help me, even after all this? She glanced down at her hands, as though uncertain of herself. Jason nodded, his determination growing. Yeah, I don't know what this all means, but I'm not going to run away just because things are weird or uncomfortable. We'll figure it out. For a long moment, Zira remained silent, her eyes searching his face, as if testing whether he truly meant what he said. Finally, she let out a slow breath and gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Thank you, she whispered. But even as she spoke those words, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that things were only just beginning. There was something in the air, a palpable shift, as though the space between them was charged with an energy he didn't fully understand. Zira had opened a door, but Jason had no idea where it would lead. He couldn't help but wonder. Was he ready for whatever came next? And more importantly, would he be able to help her through what was about to happen? He had no answers, only questions that lingered in the silence of the room. As Zira turned away, the room seemed to grow colder, and Jason felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Something was coming, something that neither of them could control. And whatever it was, it would change everything. Jason couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep within him after Zira's revelation. For days, the humming and the strange energy in the apartment seemed to linger, like an unspoken tension in the air. He had tried to go about his daily routine, but everything felt different now. Zira was no longer the calm, composed alien he had gotten used to. She was changing. And despite her reassurances, Jason couldn't help but feel that he was standing on the precipice of something he couldn't fully comprehend. Every evening, he would hear her voice echoing through the walls, speaking in that strange language again, her words punctuated by sounds that seemed almost musical, but also haunting. He'd knock on her door a few times, just to check on her, but she would always answer with a forced smile, her amber eyes dimming with what seemed like discomfort. I'm fine, Jason. Just need some space, she would say, her voice distant, as if she were hiding something. At first, Jason told himself it was just the nature of her species, that maybe aliens were private by default. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just that. Zira was battling something within herself, something far beyond what she had let on. One evening, after weeks of this growing tension, Jason couldn't take it anymore. He needed answers. He had to understand what was happening, not just for his own peace of mind, but for Zira's sake too. He couldn't ignore the fact that she seemed to be struggling, and while she insisted on dealing with it alone, Jason couldn't stand by and watch her suffer in silence. He waited until Zira was in her room, And then, with a sense of determination he hadn't felt in weeks, he knocked on her door. This time, she didn't answer right away. Jason stood there, his heart racing as the silence stretched on, the weight of his decision sinking in. He could feel the thrum of energy behind the door, like a living pulse that somehow mirrored his own nervous heartbeat. He knocked again, a little louder this time. "Zira, please. I need to talk to you." A long pause. Then the door creaked open, revealing Zira standing in the dim light of her room. Her usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by something darker, something almost desperate. Her eyes were wide, her breath shallow. She didn't say anything at first, only stared at him as if debating whether to let him in or not. Zira started, her voice faltering. "I didn't want you to see me like this." Jason could see the change in her now. It wasn't just physical, though her skin shimmered more than usual, her body tense, as if something within her was stretching to the breaking point. There was something else, something far more subtle, a shifting beneath the surface of her being that was hard to pinpoint but undeniable. She was clearly in pain, and Jason could feel the urgency of the moment, the deep need for answers that had remained locked away behind her calm exterior. "You don't have to hide from me, Zira," Jason said, his voice gentle but firm. "I know this isn't easy, but I need you to tell me what's really going on. What's happening to you?" Zira's lips parted, but she hesitated, her gaze flickering away from him as though she couldn't bring herself to speak the words. Jason could see the conflict in her, the battle between the alien instincts she was trying to control and the part of her that wanted to trust him, to let him in. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of silence, she took a deep breath and stepped back, allowing him to enter her room. As he crossed the threshold, the room seemed to vibrate with an energy that made the hairs on his arms stand up. There was an unnatural stillness in the air, and Jason realized that this was not just a conversation they were about to have, it was a turning point. Zira motioned for him to sit down, and as he did, she paced in front of him, her movements erratic, like a person fighting an invisible force. Her voice was low but steady, as though she were speaking more to herself than to him. "I've been trying to control it," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "But I don't know how much longer I can. My species, we go through cycles. Every year, during mating season, we are overwhelmed by urges, instincts that we can't ignore. It's in our biology, and there's no escaping it. We bond with others during this time, Jason, and it's—" She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "It's not something I can easily explain. We don't just choose who we bond with. It happens. It's natural. And it's not something that can be stopped." Jason sat there, his mind racing. He'd never heard of anything like this before. The idea of a creature being controlled by biological instincts to this extent was both fascinating and terrifying. But what struck him the most was the anguish in Zira's voice. This wasn't just a simple cycle or ritual. It was a battle. One that Zira was losing. "I didn't choose this," Zira continued, her hands trembling as she spoke. "I didn't choose this. I didn't choose to bond with you. But—" She stopped herself, her voice breaking for the first time. "It's happening, Jason. It's happening whether I want it to or not. And the more I try to resist, the harder it gets. It's pulling me toward you in ways I can't explain. And I don't know how to handle it. I don't want to hurt you. I don't want to force you into something you didn't ask for. But I don't have a choice. It's out of my hands now." Jason felt a rush of sympathy for her, but at the same time, he was struggling to understand it all. He could see the emotional turmoil she was going through. The confusion, the fear of losing control, the worry that she might push him away by something she couldn't control. He wanted to help her, but he didn't know how. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "Is this going to get worse? What can I do to help?" Zira's eyes flickered, the golden glow deepening as she looked at him. "I don't know," she whispered, "but whatever happens, I need you to know that I never wanted this to affect you. I didn't want to drag you into something that could change everything." Jason met her gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't turn his back on her now. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. They had to. "I'm here, Zira," Jason said, his voice strong. "I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out together." In that moment, something shifted between them, something that neither of them could explain. The air around them seemed to lighten, if only for a moment, as if the weight of the unknown was not as heavy as it had been before. But as Jason looked into Zira's amber eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. And when it did, they would both have to be ready. The days following their conversation were heavy with unspoken tension. Jason could feel the change in Zira, the subtle shift in her behavior that seemed to grow more intense with each passing hour. The humming sounds were more frequent now, a constant undercurrent that vibrated through the apartment. It was as though the very air around them was charged with something that neither of them could control. Jason could see the strain in Zira's eyes, the way her usually calm demeanor seemed to crack under the weight of her instincts. But despite all that, she still tried to maintain her composure, still tried to act as though everything was normal. It was becoming clear, however, that nothing about this situation was normal, not for either of them. Jason found himself caught in the strange limbo of wanting to help, yet feeling powerless. He couldn't fully understand what Zira was going through, nor could he imagine how it felt to be driven by instincts that seemed to control her every move. But what disturbed him the most was how she seemed to be retreating more into herself. He could sense that the pull she was feeling, the need to bond, was becoming overwhelming. And as much as she tried to fight it, Jason knew it was only a matter of time before everything she had been holding back would explode. Zira spent most of the day in her room now, her door always shut, leaving Jason to wonder what was happening behind those walls. She rarely spoke to him, and when she did, her voice was strained, distant. The quiet that filled the apartment was suffocating, and Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were both on the edge of something neither of them was ready for. One evening, Jason couldn't stand the silence anymore. He needed answers, but more than that, he needed to know that Zira wasn't completely shutting him out. He had already come to terms with the fact that whatever was happening to her was beyond his control, but he wasn't willing to let her go through it alone. He knocked on her door, his heart thudding against his chest as he waited for her to answer. It took a few moments before she opened it, and when she did, Jason was immediately struck by the change in her. Her eyes, which had once held a calm, intelligent glow, now seemed clouded with an intensity that unsettled him. She looked different, not just physically, but emotionally. The weight of the mating season had clearly taken its toll on her. "Zira," Jason said softly, not sure how to proceed. "We need to talk." She stepped aside to let him in, her movements slow, almost mechanical. As he crossed the threshold, the usual sense of warmth that he once felt in the apartment now felt suffocating, as though the very atmosphere was thick with unspoken emotions. Zira's room was darker than usual, the curtains drawn tightly, leaving only the faint glow from her amber eyes to light the space. She was standing by her bed, her hands clenched at her sides, her back straight, almost as if she were bracing herself for something. "I don't want to talk anymore," Zira said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first time she had spoken since their last conversation, and there was something about the way she said it that made Jason's chest tighten. "I don't think you can understand this, Jason. I don't think I can even explain it to you." Jason felt a pang of frustration mixed with empathy. He had been trying to understand for days, had been doing everything in his power to be patient and supportive, but he was starting to feel helpless. He didn't know what she was going through, and every time he tried to break through to her, it was like she pulled further away. "I'm not trying to understand it all at once, Zira," he said, his voice steady. "I just want you to know that you don't have to go through this by yourself." She turned away, pacing a few steps, her hands shaking slightly. Jason could see the internal battle playing out behind her eyes. She was fighting something fierce and raw that had a hold on her, something that was slowly taking control. "You don't get it," she murmured as though speaking to herself. "This is not something I can control. I wish I could, but I can't. It's part of who I am. I can't just turn it off. I can't just ignore it." Jason took a step toward her, his heart aching at the helplessness in her voice. "I'm not asking you to ignore it. I'm asking you to let me help you through it." Zira stopped pacing, her shoulders sagging in defeat. "I don't know how to let you help. I don't know how to do any of this. I can feel it. The pull, the need. It's overwhelming. I've tried to resist it, but every moment it gets harder." Jason felt the weight of her words settle on him. He could see how torn she was, how her own instincts were warring with her desire to maintain control, to not drag him into this alien world that she had tried so hard to keep hidden. The fear in her eyes was palpable now, and Jason realized that it wasn't just the instincts she was struggling with. It was the fear of what might happen if she let go, if she allowed herself to fully experience this uncontrollable urge. "You're scared," Jason said softly, more to himself than to her. Zira's head snapped up, her amber eyes locking with his. Terrified, she confessed, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what will happen if I let myself bond with you. I don't even know if I want to, but I can't ignore it anymore, Jason. It's all I can think about. It's all I can feel." Jason could see the torment in her face, the struggle between her logical, composed self and the overpowering biological urges that she had no control over. It was as though she was caught between two worlds, one where she could protect herself, maintain her sense of identity, and one where she had to surrender to something far more primal and uncontrollable. "I don't want to make this harder for you," Jason said quietly, stepping closer to her, "but you don't have to face this alone. Whatever happens, I'm here. I can't pretend to understand it, but I'm not going to run away from you." Zira's eyes filled with something that looked like a mixture of relief and sorrow, and for a moment she just stood there, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. She seemed to be struggling with what to do next, with what the right choice was in this tangled mess of emotions and instincts. "I don't know what this means," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what happens if I let myself give in to this connection, but I can't keep fighting it forever. And I don't want to keep pushing you away." Jason took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew that he wasn't going to leave her to face it alone. He had no answers, no clear plan, but he wasn't backing down now. Whatever happened, they would face it together. The bond between them, though still uncertain, was growing stronger with each passing moment. And Jason wasn't about to let it go. "Then we'll figure it out," he said, his voice firm. "Together." The tension between Jason and Zira had shifted. It wasn't just the humming that filled the apartment now. There was a palpable silence, an unspoken understanding between them that both terrified and comforted Jason. Since their conversation, Zira had been quieter than usual, withdrawn into herself in ways Jason couldn't fully understand. He knew she was struggling, the emotions swirling inside her a powerful current she couldn't escape. He could see it in the way she moved, the way she spoke, the subtle hints of panic in her eyes whenever their gazes met for too long. But she was still here, still with him, and despite the deep uncertainty that loomed over them both, Jason found himself more determined than ever to help her. The days passed slowly, each one feeling heavier than the last. Jason couldn't help but feel like time itself had become thick and suffocating, as if it too were bound by the invisible forces that controlled Zira. She spent most of her time in her room, her door always closed, but Jason could sense the unrest behind it. There were moments when the apartment seemed to hum with an energy that sent chills down his spine, Zira's inner turmoil bleeding through into the space between them. Jason's sleep became fitful, his dreams strange and fragmented, often filled with flashes of amber eyes, and a sense of being pulled towards something he couldn't quite grasp. One evening, as he was sitting on the couch, trying to focus on a book he had picked up in an attempt to distract himself, he heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. Zira stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the soft light of the hallway. Jason glanced up from the page, his heart skipping a beat as he met her gaze. Her eyes were darker than usual, the amber glow now a faint, unsettling pulse that flickered with something he couldn't place. She stood there for a long moment, her hands folded in front of her, as if she were gathering the courage to speak. "Jason," she said quietly, her voice low and hesitant. "I need to talk to you." Jason set the book down, his hand suddenly feeling cold. He nodded, not trusting his voice just yet. He had felt the change in the air, the weight of her words pressing on him before they were even spoken. Something was different now. Something had shifted. Zira stepped into the room, her movements slower than usual, as if each step was carefully measured. She sat down across from him, her posture rigid, her hands still clenched together. Jason noticed the small tremor in her fingers, a subtle sign of the internal battle she was fighting. "I'm sorry," Zira said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I've been shutting you out. I didn't want to drag you into this. I didn't want to burden you with all of this chaos inside me." Jason shook his head, the words rushing out before he could stop them. "Zira, you don't have to apologize. I don't know what you're going through, but I'm not going anywhere. You're not a burden to me." Zira's gaze dropped to her hands, her voice quieter now, more vulnerable. "You don't understand," she murmured. "You don't know what it's like to feel like you're losing yourself, to feel something so deep, so uncontrollable, that you don't even recognize your own thoughts anymore. The pull, the need to bond. It's so strong, Jason. It's like being caught in a tide that drags you further and further under until you can't breathe anymore. I've tried to keep it under control, but I don't know how much longer I can fight it." Jason sat up, his chest tightening at the rawness in her voice. He could feel her pain, could see it in the way her shoulders were hunched, the way her eyes darted nervously around the room. He wanted to reach out to her, to comfort her, but he didn't know how. This wasn't something he could fix with a simple hug or a few kind words. He knew that now. What Zira was experiencing wasn't something that could be solved. It was something she had to face. And Jason could only stand by her as she did. "You don't have to fight it alone," he said, his voice softer this time. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. You don't have to carry it all by yourself." Zira looked up at him then, her eyes searching his face for something. Hope, perhaps, or understanding. For a moment, she was silent, her breath shallow as if she were trying to find the strength to continue. Finally, she spoke again, her words heavy with uncertainty. "There's more to it than just the bonding," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's the way our species connects during this time. When we bond, we don't just connect physically. It's emotional. It's overwhelming. It's not just about desire or attraction. It's about something deeper, something that binds us in ways you can't imagine. And I don't know if you're ready for that, Jason. I don't know if I am either." Jason could feel his heart racing as he absorbed her words. He had always known that Zira was different, that there were things about her culture and her species that he could never fully understand. But hearing her speak so openly about what she was experiencing, about the depth of what was at stake, made everything feel so much more real. This wasn't just a strange alien ritual. It was a powerful, life-changing force that Zira had no control over. "I don't know what it's like for you, Zira," Jason said carefully, trying to steady his voice. "But I'm not going to back down. I want to help you. I want to understand, even if I can't fully grasp it. You don't have to face this alone." Zira looked at him for a long time, her eyes searching his face for something, maybe the reassurance she so desperately needed. Slowly, she nodded, her expression softening just a little. "I didn't think anyone would understand," she said quietly. "I didn't think anyone would even want to try. But you're still here, Jason. Even after everything, you're still here." Jason reached out, his hand brushing lightly over the top of hers. "I'm not going anywhere, Zira. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." For the first time in days, Zira's shoulders seemed to relax, and a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Thank you," she whispered. And in that moment, Jason knew deep in his bones, that things were changing. The pull between them was undeniable now, more intense than it had ever been. He didn't know what would happen next, or what it would mean for their future, but one thing was certain. He was ready to face it with her, whatever it might be. They would navigate this storm together. And somehow, that thought brought him a sense of peace. The days had blurred together. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the strange, quiet storm that hung over Jason and Zira. What had started as a quiet, inexplicable bond between two beings from vastly different worlds had turned into something far more intense, more complicated. The tension in the apartment had grown thicker, heavier, with every passing hour. Jason could feel it in his chest, a constant weight, as though every breath was drawn through an atmosphere of impending change. He could see it in Zira, too. Her eyes, once soft and serene, had become wild, filled with the inner conflict she had spoken of. The once vibrant and composed alien was now a prisoner to her own instincts, torn between what was natural and what she feared. Jason couldn't help but feel the urgency in her every movement. The way she would occasionally stop mid-step, as if caught by an invisible force. The way her eyes would flicker to him, desperate, searching for something she wasn't sure how to name. It was as if every part of her was fighting to maintain control, but with each passing moment, the struggle grew more intense. It was almost as if something within her was ready to break free, to burst through and consume her entirely. And Jason, though still deeply uncertain about what that might mean, couldn't bring himself to walk away. One evening, after yet another long, sleepless night filled with a silence that pressed down on him like a weight, Jason found himself standing in front of Zira's door. He had knocked a few times in the past week, only for her to ask for space, for time. He respected that, of course, but something told him tonight was different. The apartment felt colder, the air crackling with an energy he couldn't quite understand. And when he had finally worked up the courage to approach her again, the door had opened before he could knock a second time. Zira stood there, her amber eyes glowing brighter than he had ever seen them. The tension in her posture was unmistakable, as if she were teetering on the edge of something. And she wasn't sure if it was something she wanted to fall into, or something she needed to escape. She didn't speak at first, just stood there in the doorway, watching him. "I can't keep running from this, Jason," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with emotion. "I can't keep pretending like it's not happening, like I'm not being torn apart from the inside." Jason's heart clenched. There it was, the raw truth, laid bare in front of him. He stepped forward slowly, unsure of what to say, but knowing that this moment couldn't be ignored. This was the breaking point. Everything that had been building, everything that had been left unsaid, was about to spill over. "I'm not running from you, Zira," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I'm not afraid of you." Zira looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something. Confirmation, maybe, or perhaps reassurance. "You should be," she said, her voice quivering. "What's happening to me? What's happening to us? It's bigger than both of us, Jason. I can feel it. The instincts, they're taking over, and I don't know how to stop it anymore." Jason stepped closer, reaching out a hand, but hesitating just before he touched her. "Then we'll face it together. You're not alone in this, Zira. I'm not going anywhere. We've made it this far. We can make it through whatever comes next." Zira's eyes flickered, a moment of hesitation passing before she slowly lowered her gaze to his outstretched hand. For a long moment, neither of them moved, as if the space between them was filled with something far more than just the physical distance. It was as though the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if they would take the next step. Finally, Zira took a slow, shaky breath, "I don't know what I'm asking of you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what happens when we bond, when we connect like this. But if you choose this, if you choose me, there's no turning back. We will be bound, Jason, in ways you can't imagine." Jason's chest tightened at the weight of her words, and for a moment, he wondered if he was making the right choice. Could he truly understand the gravity of what she was asking of him? Could he handle it? And yet, deep down, in the place where his heart beat with undeniable certainty, he knew the answer. "I'm ready," he said quietly, his voice resolute. "Whatever happens, I'm ready. I'm choosing you, Zira. I'm choosing to face this with you." As the words left his mouth, something shifted in the air between them. It was subtle at first, a faint shimmer, like the beginning of a storm on the horizon. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was as though the world around them tilted, as though everything that had once seemed solid and real had suddenly become fluid, uncertain, and shifting. The energy in the room crackled, vibrant and alive. Zira's eyes widened, the glow deepening, the amber light now swirling with something more profound, more ancient than Jason could comprehend. Before he could even register what was happening, Zira's hand shot out, touching his chest. The instant her skin made contact with his, a jolt of electricity shot through him, a shock so intense that it left him breathless. It wasn't painful, far from it. Instead, it felt like a surge of life itself, coursing through his veins, filling every part of him with an energy that wasn't his own. He could feel her emotions, her fear, her desire, all of it flooding into him. But it wasn't just her feelings that he could sense. He could feel her very essence, her soul, and for a moment, it was as though their spirits had intertwined, as if they had become one. Zira gasped, her eyes locked onto his with a mixture of awe and terror. Jason, it's happening. It's happening now, and I can't stop it." Jason's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. He had no words to describe what he was experiencing. All he knew was that he could feel her in every part of him, and somehow it felt like they were both being drawn into something far greater than either of them had anticipated. But even as the bond between them deepened, a part of Jason couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Would this connection destroy them, or would it bind them together in a way neither of them had ever imagined? There was no going back now, no turning away from what had been set in motion. Zira's hand trembled as she slowly withdrew it from his chest, her gaze never leaving his face. "I didn't want to hurt you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But now that we've begun, there's no stopping it, and I don't know what it will mean for us." Jason's hand reached out, gently cupping her face as he gazed into her glowing eyes. "I don't know either, Zira," he said softly, "but we'll face it, together." And in that moment, despite the uncertainty, despite the fear that lingered in the air, Jason knew, deep down, that whatever came next, they were in this together, no matter what. The bond between Jason and Zira had grown undeniable, an unspoken thread connecting their souls in ways that neither of them could fully explain. What had started as an alien encounter had now become something far more intricate, more intimate, than either could have anticipated. The apartment that had once felt like a small, neutral space now pulsed with the strange energy they had inadvertently unleashed. The bond they shared was no longer something they could ignore. It was a presence between them, a quiet force that lingered in every touch, in every word spoken. For days after that night, Zira had been distant, almost retreating back into herself, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. It wasn't that she was pulling away from Jason. It was more that she was trying to process the overwhelming flood of emotions and instincts that came with the bond they had formed. Every part of her was in turmoil, but Jason knew that he couldn't let her go through this alone. He understood the weight of what she was carrying, the depth of her conflict. But at the same time, he knew that he was part of it now. Whatever was happening, they were in this together. The apartment had fallen into an uneasy silence over the next few days, the kind of silence that hung between them like a thick fog. Jason had tried to give Zira space, respecting her need to process, but it was difficult. He could feel her presence in every corner of the room, could sense the turbulence inside her, even when she was silent. It wasn't just the bond. They were connected in a way that went beyond anything he could have imagined. He could feel her moods shifting, her inner struggles, and it was both beautiful and terrifying. The intensity of the connection was overwhelming at times, and Jason found himself constantly wondering what would come next. Then, one evening, Zira finally spoke. It was late, and Jason had been sitting by the window, staring out into the darkness, when he heard her voice. She had been standing in the doorway, watching him quietly for what felt like hours, but he hadn't noticed until she spoke his name. It was soft, almost hesitant, as if testing the waters between them. "Jason," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to say this. I don't know what it means for us, but I need you to understand something. The bond we share, it's real. It's not just some passing thing. And it's not just physical. It's deeper than that. It's a connection that will change everything, for both of us." Jason turned to look at her, his heart racing. She was standing there in the dim light, her expression vulnerable in a way he had never seen before. Her amber eyes were softer now, the glow no longer as fierce, but there was still something intense about the way she looked at him, something that made his chest tighten with an unamiable emotion. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Zira continued, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't know what it means to be this close to someone, to feel this way. I've spent so long fighting against my instincts, against what my body and my mind are telling me to do. And now," she paused, her breath hitching, "now I'm scared." Jason stood up, his heart aching for her. He could see the raw vulnerability in her, the fear that had taken root in her heart. She had always been so composed, so in control of everything around her. But now, that control was slipping away, and she was struggling to hold on to it. It was hard for her to admit it, but Jason knew that she wasn't just scared of what was happening between them. She was scared of losing herself in the process, of becoming something she didn't recognize. "I don't know what's coming next, Zira," Jason said quietly, stepping closer to her. "But I'm not going anywhere. I'm with you. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Zira's eyes flickered, a moment of hesitation crossing her face before she slowly reached out, her hand trembling as it found his. For the first time since their bond had formed, she allowed herself to be fully vulnerable in front of him. She let him see the depth of her fear, her uncertainty. And in that moment, Jason realized that it wasn't just the bond that was pulling them together, it was their shared strength. They had both been through so much, and now they had to face whatever was ahead, side by side. "I don't know how this ends, Jason," Zira said, her voice quiet but resolute. "But I want you to know that I don't regret it. I don't regret any of this. What we've shared, it's more than just a connection. It's something real, and I can't deny that." Jason smiled gently, squeezing her hand. "Neither can I. Whatever happens next, Zira. We'll handle it. Together." For a long moment, they stood there, just holding each other's gaze, letting the weight of their words settle between them. There was still so much uncertainty ahead, so many unknowns that they had yet to face. But in that moment, in the quiet of the apartment, they both understood something that neither of them had fully realized before. This was not just a bond between an alien and a human. It was something far deeper, something that transcended the differences between them. It was a connection that had the power to change both of them, to reshape their very understanding of themselves and the world around them. Zira leaned forward then, her forehead resting gently against Jason's. She closed her eyes, as if allowing herself a moment of peace, a moment where the weight of everything they had been through could just melt away. And Jason, for the first time in a long while, felt a sense of calm settle over him as well. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living together. Whatever came next, they would face it as one. The future, though still uncertain, didn't feel so frightening anymore. Jason knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, doubts, and fears to overcome. But there was one thing that he was certain of: whatever they faced, they would face it together. Their bond was real, unbreakable, and with it, they would move forward into the unknown, not as separate beings, but as one. And for the first time in days, Jason felt ready for whatever came next. Together,